Today's program is underwritten by two entities, the Bethel College Women's Association Carolyn Schultz Lectureship Fund, and Humanities Kansas, which is a nonprofit cultural organization that connects Kansans with stories, ideas, and each other to strengthen communities. So we're grateful both to Bethel College Women's Association and Humanities Kansas today for providing funds to bring Dr. Perez here. And Dr. Kim Perez fell in love with nature as a child and continued that relationship into adulthood. She received a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Biology at Kansas State University, where she worked on Konza Prairie as a research assistant. She even pursued her own undergraduate research projects and considered pursuing a career in biology. However, her trajectory changed when she took a history of science course at the University of Oklahoma and decided it was fascinating to study scientists themselves. That means some of you in the crowd would be the subject matter and the guinea pigs on those studies. After completing an MA and a PhD in history of science at OU, Dr. Perez accepted a position in the Department of History at Fort Hays State University, where she has been for 23 years. Her research interests include women in the field of science, the nature study movement, and the boundaries between amateur scientific participation and professionalization. This evening, Dr. Perez will explore the role and impact of pioneering women in birdwatching in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on figures like Mabel Osgood Wright and Florence Merian Bailey and their relationship to the burgeoning field of ornithology, their activism, and also their role as authors. Please help me welcome Dr. Kim Perez speaking on Making the World a Better Place for Birds, Women's Authorship and Activism in Ornithology. Now you can clap.
Well, I'm not used to speaking with a mic. I'm used to projecting my voice to people in the back. So if I'm too loud, just let me know. And also one other caveat. I'm currently experiencing the allergy sort of tightness in the chest. And it was not made any better because I was hosted for a lovely dinner with the staff members here who made me talk and laugh for the whole time. So if I occasionally, I have in my pockets cough drops. If I occasionally cough, I'm okay. I'm just trying to recover here just a little bit. So again, thank you all for being here, and a special thanks to the Coffin Museum for actually inviting me out. It's been quite an interesting adventure, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of this amazing exhibit that is going up. I had the opportunity to come here a little bit earlier and to look through the exhibit, and I've decided I'm completely obsessed with the Ruth sisters and Rose Ruth. And if I were to build a table of people that I would want to sit and talk with, they would be at that table because they are just such amazing women. And so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about women's participation in ornithology. But just, you got a little bit of a background on me. But my obsession with birds and birdwatching began when I was a student at Kansas State University. And I found a book here tonight, or when I was here earlier, that actually talks about the academic lineage of ornithologists in the state. And I worked for the two that were at K-State. So I had to buy the book because I was so thrilled to actually find, I wasn't a grad student under them, but I got to work with John Zimmerman and R.J. Robel. And the best job I ever had, far and away, and this was when I was still in my early 20s. I got up at 4 a.m. every morning, met the Konza Jeep at the corner of my block, and we went out and we looked for dick sissel nests in the field. And I still point to that as the best job I've ever had. Not that I don't love being a historian of science or a historian, but it was just such an amazing experience. So I've loved birds since college. I didn't really have an introduction to them when I was a younger kid, and that was really my first introduction to them. But then after that, I went on to graduate school and discovered, again, that you could study field naturalists. And so I turned my gaze to field naturalists. And then I discovered that you could study populations that are kind of at the edge of the scientific world. And so that's really where my attention started to kind of shift. I'm interested in people at the periphery. And the vast majority of people that you have working at the periphery are really people that are in the field sciences, like ornithology. Ornithology is one of those disciplines where anyone can participate, right? You can do it in your own domestic space. You can sit at your window and look out, and you can take records like the Ruth sisters did, and still participate in ornithology. So I'm interested in ornithology, botany, field sciences, sciences where women actually got out in the field. And then I was also influenced by some mentors that decided to shift the focus to women in the sciences. And on that note, I understand that Dr. Dwight Platt is here, right? I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself before I gave you a little shout out. I watched your lecture on the Ruth sisters, and I watched, and read a little bit about it. And I have to say, what you've done in sort of preserving their record is really pretty remarkable, because oftentimes it's women who write about women's history or preserve women's history. And for you to be a professional scientist and to preserve and to realize the importance of what you had there was really pretty remarkable in the field of history of science. And so I just wanted to give you a little shout out and a thank you for preserving their stories, because it really is a pretty remarkable story. And like I said, I've been kind of obsessed with them to a point where I actually have the next article that I want to work on worked out from just preparing for this talk and thinking about the Ruth sisters. So maybe we'll have time to talk about that. So I don't think I need to tell you about the significance of birds, right? I think probably you all here are amateur birders or professional birders in some way, shape, or another, or at least you're interested in birds. But I love this quote by John Burroughs. So in 1877, John Burroughs wrote, "The very idea of a bird is a symbol and a suggestion to the poet. A bird seems to be at the top of the scale, so vehement and intense in his life. Large-brained, large-lunged, hot, ecstatic, his frame charged with buoyancy and his heart with song. The beautiful vagabonds endowed with every grace, masters of all climes and knowing no bounds. How many human aspirations are realized in their free holiday lives, and how many suggestions to the poet in their flight and their song." He perfectly captures this love affair that humans have with birds and the reason that we have been drawn to birds. They're hardy, they're adaptable, colorful creatures, they defy gravity, they lift our hearts with their very melodic and joyous song. And I mean, they're just magical creatures. So I came here a little bit early today, and I went to the place that I'm staying, and I sat on the porch. And in that time period, I heard 13 different species, and I got a new species. The one that I haven't seen, I know, right? So I'm kind of an amateur birder. I'm not a professional birder, and I don't get to spend as much time doing it as I would like. I can't be obsessive about it, because then I might be too obsessive about it. I still have a job that I have to do. But I do enjoy doing it in my spare time, and I was very pleased to get the Carolina wren today, because they don't happen, and you don't see them in western Kansas. And several brown thrashers. You don't see them very often in western Kansas, especially in the area where I live. So this has been a productive trip, not only professionally, but hey, bird-wise, I'm completely thrilled with it. Our attraction to birds are not just because of sort of their joyous nature, but also because we share so much in common with them. They court their mates publicly, right? They care for their young. We get to watch that. They form communities, and they even grieve their dead. So birds provide us a very apt symbol for our lives and an apt model for our aspirations. Now, humans' interactions with birds or interest in birds goes back before the written record, right? Human relationships with them have taken a variety of forms as well. So we know that we have used birds for sport and for sustenance. We have used them as religious and mythical symbols. They resemble angels, or maybe angels resemble them. I'm not sure about that one. They're closer to the heavens. They have They are free from the earthly constraints. They have this ability to soar above, and in that sense, they represent the human soul. And specific birds have also taken on meaning. And this is a subject that, I could give a whole separate talk on. I could actually give several separate talks on the symbolism of birds. But the spiritual meanings of birds, too, are significant. So if you look at medieval bestiaries and look at the pelican actually represents Christ. And the pelican rips open his breast to feed his young, to revive them after death, represents the sacrifice that Christ made. We have the eagle that is a symbol of strength and vision for Native Americans. And then they also have become symbols of hope and rebirth. Again, think of Emily Dickinson, hope is a thing with wings. Or symbols of national identity, which, by the way, if you want to talk afterwards, whether or not you're pro-eagle or pro-turkey, I'm happy to have that conversation as well. But also they figure largely into creation stories. So birds have been really important symbols. And part of it, I think I was listening to Lorna's talk, and she quoted, again, Dr. Platt, as saying that birds are always there, right? They are very visible symbols that we are able to watch and able to adapt or to sort of learn from and to create symbolism out of. And so they've become really important symbols for us. So our love affair with birds actually blossomed in the 19th century. There are some stories about bird watchers before that, but they're fewer and far between. It's really in the 19th century that we begin to see bird watching and ornithology kind of explode. Part of this comes from the desire of scientists to classify and to identify birds. So they wanted to catalog them. They recorded the birds that they encountered with both the pen, with paint, and even sometimes with shotguns in order to understand what's out there. But in the late 19th century, humans sought also an escape from the realities of industrialization and urbanization. And they began to retreat to nature. And birds were a very easy thing for people to turn to for solace, because again, you could just look out your window and you can see birds. We also see at that time period the perfection of binoculars, the ability to watch birds a little bit more closely, the perfection of cameras and bicycles. Bicycles gave women the freedom to go out and go birding, and a lot of women went birding with their bikes. They could move further beyond the home in the backyard to other areas. And then also apparently rowboats. I have never heard of birding by rowboat. Like, that one was completely new. I've heard of birding on a Bronco. I've heard of birding on a bicycle, birding from a car, but never from a rowboat. I'm completely fascinated with that idea of birding from a rowboat. And now I think next time I go out kayaking, I'm going to have to take my binoculars out and do a little birding from my boat. All of these things, all of these innovations actually encourage more and more people to become interested in birds. And the other thing that happened is that we began to see people encouraging the focus on the living bird rather than the bird in a collection. And so bird watching became a very popular pursuit. And it was also something that was, like I said, easy for women to participate in because they could do it in their backyards. And with these burgeoning technologies, it gave them a little bit more freedom. But it was something that they could more easily participate in than, say, something like physics, where you required a lab space, or geology, where you required a little bit more field equipment. All you needed really were good binoculars and a way to get around, perhaps just your feet. There were also in the 19th century a proliferation of bird-centered organizations. They just exploded. You have nature study lessons with birds at the center, magazines focusing on birds like Bird Lore, which later became Audubon Magazine, and books about birds. And so people were very invested in birds, but there was a dark side to this investment, in that the more people became invested in birds, the more they wanted to kind of possess them. And so we also see this fascination turning into the desire to display dead birds in their homes. In the 19th century, there was a Victorian craze for displaying natural history items. And so people would collect bird nests, birds themselves, bird feathers, bird eggs to display in their home. And again, this led to population decline, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And then there were also bird crazes of the idea of wearing a bird on your head as well. They became ornamentation. And so these collections and fashion crazes actually strained bird populations, and this crisis moved to a movement to conserve birds. Nope, too far, sorry. I don't think I need to tell you all that birds face several threats, right? There's a lot of statistics out there, but even in the 19th century, they recognized that there were a number of threats that birds were facing: overhunting and collecting, loss of habitat due to deforestation and urbanization, pollution, pesticides due to industrialization and urbanization, but also to changes in farming practices, illegal trade in birds, and then also, more recently, climate change, collisions, predation, and even disease. And so women became heavily involved in this effort to conserve birds by studying and keeping journals, like the Ruth sisters did. And by the way, their journals are incredibly elaborate and meticulous and such good data points. Women were really actively involved in the founding of the Audubon chapters. They also used their roles as teachers to teach children and even adults about birds and their significance. And they wrote a lot of books about birds as well. Now, this isn't to say that women were the only participants in this, but this is a field where women could definitely get more involved. Tomorrow, I'm giving a talk about barriers to women in the sciences. Ornithology was one of those. There were still barriers, but there were fewer barriers for women to participate in this particular science. And so tonight I want to highlight some of the involvement of specific individuals, women who were involved in this conservation effort. But before I do that, we need to talk about why women were involved in making the world a better place for birds. And I just realized this is blurry, which is really unfortunate, because this is actually one of my favorite pictures in the world. This is Mabel Osgood Wright, who I wrote my dissertation about, and her bird study class at her sanctuary. And I'm going to talk here in just a minute about Mabel Osgood Wright. But what is it about women and birds? Right? What is that special relationship of women in the 19th century and the early 20th century and birds? What is that about? Now, we know that women in the late 19th century and the early 20th century definitely accepted this idea of separate spheres for men and women, right? Men were, they were the workers, they were the ones in the public spaces, whereas women were relegated to traditional roles. They were conservators of the home, and they were caretakers within the home. And it's from these traditional roles of women that we begin to see them trying to conserve birds. They use their roles as women, as wives, and as mothers to lead the movement. Feminist historian Carolyn Merchant wrote that female conservation attempts during the Progressive Era, quote, rested on the self-interested preservation of their own middle-class lifestyles. So these women were interested in conserving how good they had it, right? And so if we're looking at women in ornithology during this time period, it is middle and upper class women primarily. These are women with means in the late 19th into the early 20th century. That's certainly shifted now. It's changed quite a bit now. Ornithology is becoming much more open and much more accepting to different populations. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was women of means, women who had a lifestyle that they wanted to preserve. They felt that if the balance of nature unraveled, that this would have really detrimental effects on their traditional home life. Now, I say this, and I'm gonna issue a caveat here, because one of the things that I have been thinking about since I started putting this talk together is the fact that only one of the women that I'm going to talk about actually had children, right? So how do these women who are not mothers in a biological sense still feel like they are preserving their sort of domestic motherhood, that they are preserving their way of life, that it's their role to save the future for their children? And I'm not quite sure. That's something that I still need to think about, and I think that's going to be the subject of my next article, because the other thing is that in addition to conserving their home life and to teaching the next generation, they also accepted roles as moral womanhood in order to maintain morality towards nature for the members of their household. So again, there's this idea that most of these women that I'm going to talk about, and most conservationists in this story, were not mothers. There's got to be something more there about the role of women in the conservation of this lifestyle, and it's not just tied to motherhood. And I like I said, I'm still kind of chewing on this, so sorry to kind of go off on a tangent here. I don't quite know what the story is here, and I need to do some digging. Because the Ruth sisters didn't have children, right? Rose Ruth did, but they didn't have children. Mabel Osgood Wright doesn't have children. Florence Merian Bailey doesn't have children. Rachel Carson doesn't have children. Minnaby Hall, I don't think she had children. And so the only one that actually had children was Harriet Hemingway. So there's something here. And so I'm giving you this argument from Carolyn Merchant only half-heartedly at this point, that this story might change. So if you've looked at the exhibit, you know that wearing bird feathers and even the whole bird on your head was definitely a Victorian-era fashion craze. It started in the 1870s. Here's the other thing that I thought that's interesting, is that Edna Ruth was a millenary. And I wonder if there was any tie there, like if she was a trained practitioner during the time period. I don't know her timeline. If there was any kind of like involvement or any sort of, any part of that story about the millinery trade and the abuse of birds that kind of affected her in her trade. And that's something, again, I don't know anything about, but I thought that was a really interesting connection. So within 15 years, the fashion craze ensured that some of the showier bird species that were used for hats, like the snowy egret, were close to extinction. So nearly 5 million birds a year were killed to meet the needs. And most of these were birds that were easily catchable, in that they were in rookeries where you could kill them in mass. And so it was much easier to kill them off. And this led to a huge crisis in bird populations. In 1886, Frank Chapman would walk down the popular streets in New York City, and over the course of 2 trips, he counted 174 different bird species, either the whole bird or part of a bird, representing 40 distinct species on women's hats. Now, I also kind of want to know what his process was like. Like, did he go up to them and like examine, or could he identify from afar? Did he take his binoculars? But this is actually a cartoon of him going down the street, looking for bird species on women's hats in New York City. And I think this is kind of interesting too, where you have the mother here who is scolding her young son who has the gun, and the replacement of the shotgun with the binoculars. So you can see Frank Chapman there is carrying binoculars. Chapman, again, if you have looked at the exhibit, you know that Chapman was one of the founders of the Christmas bird counts. And the Christmas bird count was actually developed in order to stop side hunts that people would do at Christmas time instead of just sitting around and napping after their turkey. They would go out and they would kill as much as they could in the field. And so these side hunts became very popular and then also had a huge detriment on the populations of birds as well. And so Frank Chapman said, okay, what can we do around Christmas time instead of shooting birds? What can we do that actually helps birds? And so he was part of the movement to start these Christmas bird counts where people would go out and they would actually count birds rather than kill them. So this idea of wearing a dead bird on your head, right, is essentially what they said. It got a lot of women incensed, right? And a lot of women in positions of power were incensed about it. I mean, women at the time period and domestic politics really had a say in what other women would put on their bodies. And so they felt like they could influence this craze by influencing women. And so instead of going after the millinery trade, they went after fellow women who were wearing these dead birds on their head. Again, 2 women that are in the exhibit there. So 2 Boston socialites, Harriet Lawrence Hemingway and Minnaby Hall. they were influenced to, or they were led to influence fellow women against this trend. So instead, like I said, of going after the millinery trade and saying, hey, stop this, they instead turned to the women to influence them to stop wearing these birds on their head. They invited women over to their homes for tea. And in the process of serving them tea and cookies, they enlisted their help in trying to ban this fashion craze. And it actually worked. So the other part of this that was very influential, they got women to stop wearing these hats with dead birds on them. But they also realized that the one power that women had was through their husband. Or like one of the powers, not the one, but one of the powers that they had was they were able to influence their husband. And so women, they appealed to their husband to appeal to those to stop the atrocities. So one woman told congressmen, quote, "We represent the State Federation of Women's Clubs, which has a membership of between 600 and 700, and you know that 6 or 7,000 women represent 6 or 7,000 husbands and a few thousand sons who will probably vote as their fathers vote." So they influence their husbands to use legislative tactics in order to stop this trade as well. So there was some local legislation that was actually passed in 1903 to protect herons and bitterns from the passage. But then in 1900, the Federal Lacey Act was passed as a result of this that banned interstate shipping of birds and basically killed the violation of this state law. And so it killed, women stopped wearing these hats, and then it became difficult, or impossible, I should say, illegal for the interstate traffic of birds. And so they influenced them in this particular way. And all of this had a huge effect on the millinery trade. So wearing birds as a fashion statement wasn't the only craze. And I mentioned this briefly before, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, natural history gained in popularity, and people began to collect things, collect natural history items. They collected bird eggs, bird nests, like I mentioned before, to preserve and to actually display in their own cabinets. And while this wasn't quite as destructive as the millinery trade, it still did lead to a decline in bird populations. So several women used their roles as mothers and teachers to instruct children. And this was, by the way, primarily a childhood activity. There were adults that did this, but children were very active in creating these natural history collections. And so a lot of women used their roles as mothers and teachers in order to teach them why it was not a good thing for them to collect these birds, and to shift the focus again away from looking at dead birds to living birds. And some of them actually used the pen to do this. So there were a number of really fantastic female authors during the late 19th, early 20th century. I don't know if you've read Althea Sherman or Nelt G. Blanchin or Olive Thorne Miller, but the two that I'm going to talk about are two of my personal favorites, Mabel Osgood Wright and Florence Merian Bailey. Both of them, they were very, very different people. But they did have two things in common. And the first is that they've shifted the focus to the living bird. And the second was that they used their pen in order to do this. So my first subject, well, actually, let's just stay here. My first subject is to talk about Mabel Osgood Wright. How many of you have heard of Mabel Osgood Wright? Anyone know who she is? One person? Well, like I said, she would be at my dinner table. Like, I would love to sit down and have a conversation with her. She's such a fascinating individual. Her father was a really famous preacher in New York City. She grew up in New York City. She has a really great biography where she talks about growing up in Greenwich Village. She went to the American Museum of Natural History. She actually watched it burn down. There's a famous picture of Theodore Roosevelt watching the Lincoln's funeral procession. She was in the same room with Theodore Roosevelt and actually was a dancing partner with Theodore Roosevelt as a child. And didn't like him because he didn't like to dance, and he would kick her in the shins frequently or step on her feet. And so she was really kind of in the mix of it. The other thing that's really kind of interesting about her is that her what is it when you have like a symbolic father? I'm blanking right now. Her godfather was William Cullen Bryant. And so she learned to quote poetry at the knee of William Cullen Bryant, right? And so she had a pretty remarkable life. She marries. She marries an art dealer, a historic art and book dealer who has a business in New York City, but they move out to the family property in Connecticut and he commutes in. So she's primarily at home in this domestic space in Fairfield, Connecticut, watching birds and gardening all day long. In her time, she wrote voluminously about nature and especially about birds. Birds was kind of her special love. She published 27 books, 8 of them were for children. Her books were a variety of different things from field guides to narrative field guides, children nature stories, and even nature romances. So she wrote quite a bit. She also wrote for Bird Lore, which later becomes the Audubon magazine. She actually ends up becoming an editor for them, especially in the school department. She wrote for the New York Times. She wrote until essentially the day that she died, but she was also an activist. So she was one of the founding members of the Connecticut Audubon Society. And one of the things that's really quite remarkable about her is that she established the first sanctuary, first private sanctuary in the United States on her family property. You can still go there today. Unfortunately, the highway, the vein outside of New York City leading north, goes right through the middle of that property. And half the property was actually sold off. So you can be in the middle of that property and still hear cars, which is really unfortunate. But it's still a really beautiful, beautiful property. She, excuse me, she dedicates her life to the preservation of birds. So one of the things that she does, in addition to her narrative field guides and all this stuff, she actually co-wrote a book with Elliot Kouse, who was an ornithologist. And so she knew kind of the scientific side of it, but she realized that the way to get people involved in the love of birds was to kind of tug at their heartstrings. And so she wrote several books for children. And the books were kind of fanciful. So this is what I wrote my dissertation about. So I could go on for days about this, and I'm not going to. I'm going to spare you this. But if you have questions, just let me know. She wrote a number of children's books that kind of anthropomorphized birds and animals. Not just birds, but other animals as well. And she did this because she realized that the way to get children interested in conserving birds was to relate to them and to relate to their story. And so in her book, Tommy Ann and the Three Hearts, which is a fascinating book in and of itself, she tells the story of Tommy Ann, who meets Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Robert of Lincoln, in the field by her home. And Mr. Lincoln tells her about his wife and how she tragically went missing, and then he saw her again, and she was attached to the top of a young girl's hat. And so she relays this story. And so I'm just going to read some of the story, and so you can get an idea of the language that she uses. Quote, "Some house people were picking apples nearby," and this is Mr. Lincoln speaking, "but I did not fear them, and my heart leaped up, for close beside the fence I saw my mate sitting on a brown nest-like thing, and her wings upraised as if to fly to me, only she didn't move." So he's describing his wife. "I called, she didn't answer. I flew down and touched her with my beak. She didn't stir. I grasped her with my claws and gave her a shake, but she was bewitched and held fast to the brown straw upon which she was perching. Meanwhile, the house child picked up the thing on which my mate was fastened to and put it on her head. I saw that it was a leaf that they wear to keep the sun off their hat, or they keep the sun off, called a hat. And he realizes finally that his wife is dead and has been attached to the top of a hat. So he's sharing this story with Tommy Ann, who at that point realizes it was her hat. And she bursts into tears and admits that she didn't know the significance of the loss that would be incurred by putting a bird on her hat, and how sorry she is to Mr. Lincoln that he lost his wife. And so she's pulling at the heartstrings, but she's also appealing to things that humans can understand, and that is loss, right? She's anthropomorphizing birds and putting this loss in a very human type, or in human language that little humans can understand, to realize that wearing a dead bird on your head is not a good thing. So as you can imagine, She writes with a lot of emotion, a lot of anthropomorphization in order to help students, especially children, understand the consequences of their actions. Now, I could go, like I said, I could go on about Mabel Osgood Wright, because there's a lot of really neat things that she does in her literature, but I don't have time today. I'm going to turn to Florence Merian Bailey. So how many of you have heard of Florence Merian Bailey? So another fascinating figure. Now, what's interesting is that Bailey grew up in a very scientific home. Those of you that are maybe in zoology or have taken mammalogy might know her brother, Seahart Merriam. He was a really well-known mammologist at the time period. He was known for his work also with the Biological Survey. So she grew up in a home where science was openly discussed. Her brother was a scientist. She would go into the field with her brother, where she met her husband, which was Vernon Bailey, who was also a scientist for the Biological Survey. They kind of enabled her ability to get out in the field, right? She was rather sickly. They suspect that she had tuberculosis and was sickly most of her life, but because of the aid of her brother and her husband, she spent a lot of time actually working in the field and studying birds. She became passionate about birds in college. She was encouraged by her family friend, Ernest Thompson Seton. How many of you have heard of him? Really well-known 20th century author, Wild Animals I Have Known. He was really popular and really controversial. I mean, but the idea of having Ernest Thompson Seton as your family friend is just kind of remarkable to me. And he said, you should pursue ornithology. And so she did. She went to college. She and her friend actually started the local chapter of the Audubon Society at Smith College, and it was highly successful. And after that, she goes on to write her first book, which was Birds Through an Opera Glass. She also wrote A Birding on a Bronco, which she has great titles for her books. But one of the things that I think is remarkable about this book, these are 50 birds that she highlighted for Audubon magazine, and she decided to compile them into an actual book. But here she's talking about using opera glasses. So this was before the really high development of binoculars. Women would use opera glasses in order to observe birds. And so she's encouraging women to get out in the field and to look at living birds. Again, this is part of the movement to keep people from killing birds. You should instead watch them in their natural living habitat. So at the beginning of her books, she says, quote, "When going to watch birds, provided with an opera glass and a notebook and dressed in inconspicuous colors, proceed to some good birdie place, a bushy bank of a stream or an old juniper pasture, sit down in the undergrowth or against a concealing tree trunk with your back to the sun to look and listen in silence. You will be able to trace most songs to their singers by finding which tree the song comes from and then watching for movement, as birds are rarely motionless long at a time when singing. It will be a help if, besides writing a careful description of both bird and song, you draw a rough diagram of the bird markings and put down the actual notes of his song as nearly as it may be." So she's giving the method to women to go out and to observe birds. She's giving them the tools that they need and also encouraging them to take meticulous notes. She goes on to write a number of regional field guides, really well-known popular field guides throughout her career, but then also encouraging people to be respectful of their feathered friends. All right. So the final person I'm going to talk about, you know what tomorrow is, right? Earth Day, right? I don't think we can talk about, I can't think about Earth Day and not think about Rachel Carson in some way, shape, or form. So Rachel Carson was not an ornithologist at all. She was a marine biologist. She was also a trained scientist. She got a bachelor's and a master's in zoology. She was going to go on and do a PhD, but actually was stopped by the Great Depression, and so was not able to go on and pursue those. She got a government job, and so she was a trained scientist who was interested in the impact that pesticides had on birds. So she becomes increasingly alarmed in the 1950s because of the widespread use of pesticides. And again, this is post-World War II. You have all the innovations of science that are happening at the time period, nuisance insects that were creating issues, and pesticides kind of became the solution to those nuisance insects, right? And so people were pushing them. Carson was not saying that you shouldn't use pesticides, but she was saying that you should use them cautiously and judiciously, right? And so she begins to kind of become increasingly alarmed at the effect that pesticides have, and especially that pesticides have on animal populations. She's concerned about birds, but birds are only part of the story for her. But I think it's a really interesting part of the story. So in 1959, she wrote a letter to the Washington Post that linked the recent use of pesticides to the decline in bird populations, directly linked them. And while that she was working on her book, Silent Spring. So Silent Spring is a metaphor for a world without birds, right? If you've read Silent Spring, you know that she starts out by talking about this idyllic little town. The first chapter is a fable for tomorrow. And she describes this town that's teeming with life and with beauty and with song. And then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Animals started getting sick, people started getting sick, and then she wrote, quote, "And there was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people, baffled and disturbed, spoke of them. The feeding stations in the backyard were deserted. The few birds that we have seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. In the mornings, which had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, and wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was only now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and the woods and the marshes." So birds are the canary in the coal mine, right? They are the indicator that something is wrong with the use of pesticides. And she goes on a mission to stop the use of, specifically of DDT, that is harming bird populations. It's quite a controversial effort that she makes. I don't know if there was a documentary, not a documentary, there was a CBS show that was called Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where they have her come in, which, by the way, Rachel Carson dies of cancer and is going through cancer treatment during this time period. And they call her in to interview her, and so she is wearing, a nice shirt and a skirt. She's talking very rationally, very calmly, very scientifically. But then they call in a man with a lab coat to kind of basically just roll her over the coals. They just destroy her in this and make her look like she's irrational for making this plea. But she's effective, right? So her Silent Spring becomes one of the most popular books. In 1970, there are actually several congressional hearings about the use of pesticides and the effects. And in 1970, as a direct result of the book, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, and Earth Day was also first celebrated. And it resulted in a ban of DDT in the United States and several other countries. Now, it wasn't just an effort for birds, but it certainly did help bird populations, right? So there was a rebound after the banning of DDT in bird populations. Unfortunately, of late, as many of you know, that rebound has gone the opposite direction. And we're now in a period where birds are facing an even bigger crisis than they have in the past. Like I said, as you undoubtedly know, tomorrow is Earth Day. And so I felt like this was a really kind of appropriate way for me to honor those people who contributed to the conservation of Earth. The stories of Mabel, Osgood, Wright, Florence, Merian, Bailey, Rachel Carson, I think mesh really nicely with the stories of the Ruth sisters and with Ruth Rose, sorry, I got those backwards. These are kind of the pioneers of this effort to conserve not just birds, but to conserve a way of life that we've all kind of learn to appreciate and love. So with that, questions? I've rambled on enough. Anybody have any questions, comments, anything? I always tell my students, I have days where my hamster starts, is just not running, the one that runs my brain. Like, do you all have hamsters that make your brain go? Yeah. My hamster's ready for summer right now, so I apologize. Any questions? I'm much better at questions.
Do you have a favorite bird? Do you have a favorite bird?
Do I have a favorite bird? I've never thought of that.
She's never thought of that.
Come back to me. Come back to me. I'll have to think about that one, because I could list off a bunch of them, but I'm trying to think right now the ones that bring me the most joy. I don't know, ones that are in my backyard. So one of the talks that I listened to Lorna's talk that she gave here, and she was talking about eBird.
Could you go back to the mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I did listen to Lorna's talk, and she was talking about eBird. 2 years ago, I had a yellow warbler in my yard, which is very rare in western Kansas. I thought I was seeing things. I thought I imagined it. I took several pictures and posted them on eBird to make sure that I confirmed it and make sure that it was correct. And then I came home one day, and there was a guy sitting in my front yard. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, sitting in my front yard with a camera focused on my house. And I was like, what is going on here? And then I finally realized, he was there to see the warbler. So maybe the yellow warbler. I don't know. I think it depends on the day. I recently went to see the sandhill cranes. I got to say, I love them. Prairie chickens are fun. Gosh, I don't know. That's a hard question. Other questions?
What's the next article that you're thinking about writing?
Yeah, so this idea that it's because of moral womanhood and mother, like being a mother, that kind of compels these conservationists. But then you have all of these women. So if you look at a lot of the female conservationists during the time period, they opted not to have children. So they weren't actually mothers. So I need to kind of play that out. There's something more there about womanhood, about the idea of women being teachers. Women were primarily, if they got an education, they became teachers. I don't know if that's what's feeding into it. And so the Carolyn Merchant's quote that she talks about, they were invested in motherhood and the next generation and their middle-class lifestyle. I agree with the middle-class lifestyle, but I'm not sure about the motherhood. What is it that compels these women who don't care about subsequent generations, like intimately, who don't have children themselves? Why are they turning to become conservationists? So I don't know the answer to that, but I need to think about it.
So, okay, so maybe the women who didn't have children had more time?
No, I think there's definitely something about that. But then Harriet Hemingway had 5 children. But she was also a Boston socialite, so maybe she had help, right? So there might be something there to that. I think there's definitely something there to the idea that they had more time to write, and they turned their pursuits elsewhere, to gardening, to bird watching, to all of these other things. I guess my issue is with Carolyn Merchant's argument, and that's what I would challenge. But yeah, I definitely think there's something to that. Did you have a question?
No, I was just going to make the same comment. They had more time, and maybe by not having kids, the birds become more kids.
I think, and I think there is something to that as well, right? So when you look at Mabel Osgood Wright, the idea that she used anthropomorphization and fancy to create an emotional connection to nature, I can see in her writing that she had an emotional connection to nature. And not to equate that with a person having children, but I think an emotional connection to something helps, it makes you want to save it, right?
Swaddling children simply scare the birds off.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, but there's something more to that idea of motherhood. I don't want to speculate here. I'm not going to speculate on camera about this. I can have a private conversation with you about issues of motherhood and how this might affect it, but I don't want to do it publicly yet.
If a lot of these women were teachers, they were really concerned about children.
But they weren't
mean-
formal teachers.
Oh, they weren't
No,
formal
no, they
teachers.
did not go to college. Mabel, Osgood, Wright didn't go to college. Florence, Merian, Bailey went to college to get a science degree.
So
right.
they didn't teach little children.
No, but they couldn't get jobs in the sciences. The only jobs that they could get as teachers, right? And so that's why they were kind of relegated in the sciences to popular science, is because they couldn't get jobs in universities or museums and other institutions like male scientists could give. And so they essentially were relegated to teaching about the subjects that they were interested in the next generation. So, yeah, they weren't formally teachers. But that's what women could do at the time period, was teach, instruct.
If you say this is a bad time for birds right now, in a short while, can you tell us the problem and the solution?
No. No, again, I listened to Lorna's talk, and she talked about making a national park in your backyard. You know, doing anything that you can to ensure that bird and insect populations, and of course insect populations because of birds, using native species, things like that. And so we were talking about this at dinner. You know, I'm actively trying to turn my side yard into a place where birds are comfortable. You know, and so I think you plant native species, you plant gooseberries, you plant things that are, you know, will interest birds, that'll attract insects so birds can have them, etc. But beyond that, you're recording this, right? I'm kind of pessimistic, unfortunately. I would like to say that I'm optimistic. The way things have been moving, I'm not overly optimistic right now. But I think we can do our little part in our corner.
Do you think ornithology is increasing or the interest in, or is it decreasing?
And repeat the question.
So is the interest in ornithology and bird watching in general increasing or decreasing? I'd say it's increasing. And one of the movements, well, several movements of late, are the ideas of sort of increasing who's interested in bird watching. So historically, like I talked about, it had been upper middle class white women. And then the scientists were upper middle class white men, right? But now we have movements where we have people of color that are becoming increasingly interested in bird watching. We have children, so Audubon has put together children packs for kids to go out and go birding in the field. So I think the more different groups we can get interested in it, the increased interest that we're going to have. So it's not just going to be confined to a certain group of people. It's going to be something that's broader and more people can participate in it. That's what I think. As far as like numbers of birders, I don't know. Here's the other thing though, is that we also have a population that's less connected with nature now. And it cycles over time, right? This is one of the things that I'm interested in with my research, is how interest in nature cycles based upon what's going on culturally. We're further away from nature now than we have been for a variety of reasons. And so I think there's fewer people that have less time, right? We're all tied, unfortunately, to these things. I would rather sit at my window. Like, that's one of the things when I was looking at the Ruth story that I was really enthralled by, is the idea that they had the time and the energy to make these meticulous records that I don't feel like I have right now. I would love to do that. And so because we live in a faster pace, more harried world, I don't think we're able, or we're not giving ourselves the space to do those kinds of things. So there's good and bad.
What is your feeling about the bird apps, I'm calling it?
They make my life easier. I mean, I use them. I use them all. And I love them. Like, I used it today. Like I said, I got like 12, 13 species by sitting out on the porch where I'm staying. And I would not have known what a Carolina wren was, like, without, or known that it was a Carolina wren. And I wasn't going to go digging through like the neighbor's property to find it, you know? And so I got an idea what it was, and then I knew what to look for and where to look. So I actually love it. I really do. And then I can see what's in the area. So I go on frequently and look at eBird and say, okay, what have they seen lately? Ooh, where have they seen it? Okay, I'm going to go try to find it. I try not to go to people's front yard and like sit in their front yard with a camera pointed at their house, though. You know, that's a whole different thing. When I realized what he was doing, I was okay. But at first it was just like, what in the world is going on here? So I don't know. What do you all feel about those birding apps? You're on board? Okay, spoken from an endorsement from an ornithologist. Good to know. Actually, I was telling him at dinner, I wrote my master's thesis on Arthur Allen, who was the first person that started the bird recordings at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so he started actually recording birds in the field. And so I think it's kind of full circle that I'm now using an app that is based upon the person that I wrote my master's thesis' original work. Like he started it. And so to me, it feels in many ways kind of nostalgic too. That it's a nod to Arthur Allen in my mind.
Kim, are you okay going back to Harriet Hemingway for a second?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So she was originally Harriet Lawrence, right? And Amos Lawrence is her father, and Amos Lawrence is a famous Boston abolitionist. Is that a one-off thing, or do you think that do you suspect that there are ties to, say, abolitionist or Emersonian kind of schools of thought across those sort of burgeoning conservationist movements in salons and front rooms and that sort of thing?
I don't know that I could speak directly because I have never put these two things together about abolitionism and bird conservation. I would have to really think about that one long and hard, but definitely progressive politics. Like, so all of these women that we're talking about were raised in households with very progressive politics. They were encouraged to get an education, even if it wasn't a formal education, to educate themselves in things. Many of them oftentimes listened to their fathers, spouses, brothers, who were definitely involved in these conversations of science, but also of political activism, and were influenced by it. So I think there's definitely a link there. I just can't draw direct lines to know what that is, what those links are. That's something to think about. Actually, I'm going to write that down.
Any other questions? All right, well, I'm sure Kim would be willing to take other questions if you want to come up to the podium afterwards. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and appreciate it very much. And thank you so much to Kim.
Hey, thank you. Abolitionism.
Some bird sounds going.